The Arrival. A man walked through steel doors into a world where weakness invited destruction. Everyone assumed they knew his story before he spoke a single word. But what happened when assumptions collided with reality? Get ready for a narrative that will challenge everything you believe about strength and survival. If you're seeking stories of genuine transformation, subscribe now. This journey will reshape your understanding of true power. Marcus Webb entered Riverbend Correctional Facility on a Tuesday morning in late September. The intake officer processed his paperwork with mechanical efficiency, barely glancing at the quiet man before him. Marcus stood 6 feet tall with an unremarkable build, his brown eyes calm behind wire-rimmed glasses. Nothing about his appearance suggested anything beyond ordinary. The escort guard led him through corridors painted institutional beige. Other inmates watched from their cells, evaluating, calculating, measuring threat levels with practiced precision. Marcus kept his gaze forward, his breathing steady and controlled. His movements possessed an economy that suggested deliberate thought rather than nervous energy. "You'll be in C block," the guard announced, his tone suggesting this information mattered more than Marcus might understand. C block housed the facility's most volatile population, men whose reputations preceded them like shadows cast by violent pasts. Marcus nodded once, accepting this reality without complaint or visible concern. The guard noted this response with mild curiosity. Most new arrivals exhibited anxiety in various forms: excessive talking, defensive posturing, or studied indifference that barely concealed fear. This man displayed none of these markers. The cell assignment placed Marcus 2 doors down from Danny Crusher Morrison. Crusher had earned his nickname through 15 years of maintaining dominance through strategic violence and psychological intimidation. He controlled C Block's informal economy, determined work assignments through backroom negotiations, and settled disputes with brutal finality. Respect flowed toward him not from admiration, but from fundamental survival instinct. Marcus arranged his few belongings with methodical care: a handful of books, basic toiletries, 3 changes of institutional clothing. He positioned everything with precise attention, creating order within confined space. His cellmate, a wiry man named Torres serving time for fraud, watched this process with wary interest. "You know where you are?" Torres asked finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "I'm aware," Marcus replied, his voice carrying neither bravado nor submission, simply acknowledgement. "Crusher runs things here. You'll figure out the rules quick enough." Torres paused, weighing his next words. "Stay invisible. That's the best advice I can give." Marcus finished organizing his shelf before turning to face Torres directly. "I appreciate the guidance," he said, offering a slight nod of genuine gratitude. That evening, as men gathered for dinner in the common area, Marcus moved through the space with the same unhurried composure he'd maintained since arrival. He selected his meal, found an empty section of table, and began eating with focused attention. Across the room, Crusher observed this new presence with calculating interest. Something about the man's demeanor triggered his predatory instincts, not fear, but curiosity about what lay beneath such deliberate calm. The pattern of power in confined spaces operates through unwritten codes that newcomers violate at tremendous personal cost. Most men learn these lessons through painful experience. But what happens when someone navigates invisible boundaries with unexpected precision? This chapter reveals dynamics that most people never witness. Stay engaged, because the psychological complexity only deepens from here. Marcus established his routine within the first week. He woke before sunrise, spending 30 minutes in motionless meditation that Torres initially mistook for extended sleep. After breakfast, he worked his assigned position in the facility's maintenance department, performing tasks with thorough competence that neither exceeded expectations nor invited additional responsibility. During recreation periods, he occupied a corner of the yard, sometimes reading from worn paperbacks, occasionally sitting in silent observation. Other inmates flowed around him like water around stone, recognizing his presence without engaging it directly. Crusher watched these patterns with growing irritation. The new man hadn't sought permission, hadn't acknowledged the existing hierarchy, hadn't demonstrated appropriate deference, yet he also hadn't challenged anything directly. This ambiguous positioning violated Crusher's established framework for categorizing threats and opportunities. "What's his story?" Crusher asked his lieutenant, a muscular man named Vince who handled information gathering. Vince shrugged. Clean record inside. Keeps to himself. No gang affiliations we can identify. No obvious weaknesses. He paused. No obvious strengths either. This assessment frustrated Crusher more than outright defiance would have. Defiance, he understood. It invited correction through established methods. This neutral existence suggested either ignorance or something more unsettling. On Thursday afternoon, Crusher engineered a testing moment. During lunch, he positioned himself in Marcus's path, creating a situation where the new inmate would need to navigate around him or request passage. Most men demonstrated their understanding of hierarchy through such moments, offering verbal acknowledgement or physical deference. Marcus approached without altering his pace. 3 feet away, he stopped completely, making brief eye contact without challenge or submission in his expression. He stood in absolute stillness, waiting with the patience of someone willing to remain indefinitely. The moment stretched. Other inmates sensed the potential confrontation, conversations dropping to whispers. Crusher felt the weight of watching eyes, the expectation of his response. Moving aside suggested weakness. Forcing confrontation over nothing suggested insecurity. Marcus broke the stalemate with unexpected grace. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his tone carrying neither fear nor aggression, simply a polite request between two people sharing limited space. The neutrality of this approach disarmed Crusher's prepared responses. After a heartbeat's hesitation, he shifted slightly, allowing passage. Marcus nodded once in acknowledgement and continued toward his destination. Vince appeared at Crusher's elbow moments later. "What was that?" "I'm figuring it out," Crusher muttered, his jaw tight with unresolved tension. That evening, Marcus sat reading while Torres paced their cell with nervous energy. "You're playing a dangerous game," Torres said finally. "Crusher doesn't forget people who don't fall in line." Marcus marked his page before responding. "I haven't challenged anything. I've simply existed within available space." "That's not how he'll see it." Torres stopped pacing, meeting Marcus's calm gaze. "He needs to establish where you fit. If you won't show him, he'll force the issue." Marcus considered this assessment with the same thoughtful attention he applied to everything. "Then we'll address that situation when it arrives," he said simply, returning to his book. The first test conflict reveals character with unforgiving clarity. When violence threatens, most people discover exactly who they are beneath carefully constructed facades. But what happens when someone responds to aggression with neither submission nor escalation? This chapter explores a confrontation that defies conventional expectations. Keep reading, because what happens next will challenge your assumptions about strength and survival. The confrontation arrived on a Monday during recreation time. Crusher had spent the weekend reinforcing his position through smaller demonstrations of dominance, building momentum toward an inevitable collision with Marcus's persistent neutrality. Marcus stood near the perimeter fence, observing the yard's complex social choreography. Men clustered by affiliation, maintaining territorial boundaries through unspoken agreement. Basketball games unfolded with competitive intensity that occasionally sparked genuine conflict. Weightlifting areas attracted those who invested in physical intimidation as currency. Crusher approached with 3 of his closest associates, their formation intentionally theatrical. Other inmates recognized the setup, creating space while maintaining visual contact. Entertainment was scarce in institutional life. Potential violence drew attention like moths to flame. "You and me need to talk," Crusher announced, his voice pitched to carry across the immediate area. Marcus turned to face him, his expression unchanged from the mild observation he'd maintained moments before. "All right," he said simply, offering neither resistance nor enthusiasm. This response again disrupted Crusher's script. He'd expected either defensive posturing or attempted de-escalation through verbal submission. This neutral acknowledgement suggested incomprehension of the moment's stakes or something more dangerous. Absolute confidence. "You think you're special?" Crusher continued, probing for emotional response. "Think you can walk around here like you don't need to respect how things work?" Marcus remained silent for several heartbeats, his breathing steady and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried no more emotion than if discussing weather patterns. "I respect everyone here, including you." "Then why haven't you paid your dues?" Crusher stepped closer, entering personal space boundaries. Everyone contributes. That's how community works. I haven't been asked to contribute anything specific, Marcus replied, still maintaining his disconcerting calm. If there's something particular you need, I'm willing to discuss it reasonably. The word reasonably landed like a subtle challenge. It suggested negotiation between equals rather than supplication from subordinate to superior. Crusher felt his anger rising, a familiar sensation that preceded violent resolution. Here's what's reasonable, Crusher said, his tone hardening. You acknowledge who runs things, or you learn the hard way. Marcus held eye contact without aggression or fear clouding his gaze. I understand your position here. I'm not challenging it. He paused, choosing his next words with care. But I also won't pretend to be afraid when I'm not. The admission hung in the air like unexpected smoke. Crusher processed this statement, searching for hidden mockery or veiled threat. He found neither, only straightforward honesty that somehow felt more insulting than direct challenge would have been. You should be afraid, Vince interjected, stepping forward with coiled menace. Marcus shifted his attention to Vince without urgency. Fear is a response to perceived danger. I don't perceive immediate danger in this moment. His gaze returned to Crusher. Unless you're telling me I should. The question hung between them, forcing Crusher to choose explicit escalation or implicit retreat. Violence here would prove his dominance, but also suggest Marcus's neutrality threatened him enough to require physical correction. Letting the moment pass risked appearing weak before watching eyes. A guard's voice cut through the tension. Everything all right here? Crusher's jaw tightened with frustration at the interrupted confrontation. Just talking, he called back. The guard lingered, his presence preventing immediate escalation. Crusher stepped back slightly, recalculating his approach. We'll continue this conversation later, he told Marcus. Hidden foundations. Every person carries histories that shape their present responses to crisis. Surface observations rarely reveal the depths beneath. What prepared Marcus for this moment? Understanding his foundation changes everything about how you'll view what comes next. Don't skip ahead. This revelation is essential to comprehending the transformation that follows. That evening, Torres couldn't contain his nervous energy. You realize you just made an enemy of the most dangerous man in this facility, he said, pacing their small cell. Marcus sat on his bunk, back against the wall, hands resting loosely on his knees. I made no enemies today. I simply declined to perform fear I don't feel. That's the same thing in here. Torres stopped, studying his cellmate with frustrated confusion. What are you, man? Who were you before this? Marcus considered the question thoughtfully. He rarely shared personal history, finding that people's preconceptions often obscured genuine understanding. But Torres's genuine concern deserved honest response. I was a teacher, Marcus said simply. Philosophy and ethics at a small liberal arts college. Torres blinked, processing this unexpected information. A teacher? How does a philosophy professor end up in Riverbend? Vehicular manslaughter, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the weight of those words. I was driving home from campus. The roads were wet. A young woman stepped into traffic suddenly, and I couldn't stop in time. He paused, his gaze distant with remembered horror. She died at the scene. 23 years old. The cell filled with heavy silence. Torres sank onto his own bunk, the revelation recontextualizing everything he'd observed about Marcus. The prosecutor argued reckless driving, excessive speed despite conditions. The evidence was ambiguous. Accident reconstruction experts disagreed. But her family needed accountability, and I was the available target. Marcus's hands remained still, his composure unbroken despite discussing his life's greatest tragedy. I accepted the plea agreement. 5 years seemed appropriate penance, even if the legal guilt was debatable. That's why you're so calm, Torres said slowly. You've already faced the worst thing possible. Marcus shook his head slightly. Not entirely. My composure comes from practices I developed long before that night. He shifted position, making room for fuller explanation. I studied martial arts for 22 years. Not for competition or combat, but as moving meditation. Aikido specifically, the art of harmonizing energy rather than opposing it through force. Torres leaned forward, his earlier anxiety temporarily forgotten in curiosity. You're saying you could fight if you wanted to? Fighting implies opposing force with force, creating collision and destruction. What I learned was something different, the art of receiving aggression and redirecting it without creating additional violence. Marcus's expression remained thoughtful, pedagogical. The highest application of martial skill is the prevention of conflict through centered presence. Crusher doesn't care about philosophy, Torres said pragmatically. Perhaps not consciously, but people respond to genuine centeredness even when they don't understand why. Marcus met Torres's gaze directly. Predators seek prey animals, those who signal vulnerability through fear or compensatory aggression. Someone who signals neither becomes difficult to categorize, which creates hesitation. You're making him hesitate, Torres said, understanding dawning. But hesitation in a man like Crusher just builds pressure. Eventually, he'll need to resolve the uncertainty. Yes, Marcus acknowledged. Which is why I'm preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Not with fear or aggression, but with clarity about what's necessary. Torres studied his cellmate with new awareness. The quiet man who meditated each morning, who moved through the facility with unhurried purpose, who read philosophy texts during recreation. This was someone who'd spent decades cultivating internal discipline that most people never attempted to develop. What happens when he comes for you? Torres asked quietly. Marcus was silent for a long moment. I'll do what's necessary to preserve safety without creating unnecessary harm. The specifics will depend on the nature of his approach. You're talking in circles, Professor. A slight smile touched Marcus's lips, the first real expression of warmth Torres had witnessed. Old habits. Let me be direct. I won't initiate violence. I won't submit to threats. I will protect myself if attacked, but only to the degree necessary to end immediate danger. The storm gathers. Institutional environments magnify tensions through proximity and limited options. When powerful men feel their authority questioned, escalation becomes inevitable. The question isn't whether conflict will arrive, but how it will resolve. What happens next will test everything Marcus has cultivated. Keep reading, because this confrontation reveals truths about strength that most people never discover. The weekend arrived with its particular tensions. Reduced staff created opportunities for inmates to settle disputes without immediate intervention. Crusher had spent the week building social pressure around Marcus, isolating him through whispered campaigns and meaningful glances. During Saturday breakfast, Marcus found his usual section of table occupied by 3 of Crusher's associates. Not an accident. He adapted without comment, selecting a different location. This flexibility frustrated Crusher's strategy of forcing confrontation through territorial restriction. At the recreation yard, similar dynamics unfolded. Basketball courts were suddenly full when Marcus approached. Weight equipment developed phantom reservations. The message was clear. Submit or face collective ostracism. Marcus responded by finding alternative activities. He walked the yard's perimeter with meditative focus, counting steps, regulating breathing, maintaining the internal equilibrium he'd developed through decades of practice. Other inmates watched this adaptation with mixed reactions, some seeing weakness, others recognizing something harder to define. Crusher conferred with Vince near the basketball court, his frustration visible even from a distance. He's not reacting, Vince observed. Nothing we do gets a rise. Then we escalate, Crusher decided. Tonight, during movie time, somewhere the guards can't see, but everyone else can. Vince nodded, already calculating logistics. The common room during weekend film screenings offered perfect conditions, crowded enough for witnesses, chaotic enough for plausible deniability, understaffed enough for delayed intervention. Marcus, unaware of these specific plans but sensing the building pressure, spent the afternoon in deliberate preparation. He ran through forms in his mind, not rehearsing violence but cultivating the mental clarity necessary for responding appropriately to whatever emerged. His breathing exercises deepened. His awareness sharpened, his center stabilized. Torres watched these preparations with growing anxiety. Maybe you should skip the movie tonight, he suggested. Stay in the cell, let things cool down. Avoiding inevitable confrontation only postpones resolution while signaling fear, Marcus replied calmly. If tonight is when things clarify, I'd rather meet that moment with intention than have it forced upon me later. You're talking like you want this fight. They walked in silence for several moments before Martinez continued. Some advice, Professor, because I know who you are and why you're here. The next few days are critical. Crusher has choices to make about how he responds to what happened. If he chooses escalation, things will get dangerous. If he chooses adaptation, you might have inadvertently created an opportunity for change. Change toward what? Marcus asked. That depends on both of you. Back in his cell, Torres practically vibrated with nervous energy. Everyone's talking about what happened. They're saying you threw Crusher like he weighed nothing. That's not accurate, Marcus said calmly, sitting on his bunk. I redirected his momentum using basic principles of leverage and timing. His own force did most of the work. Nobody cares about the technical details. They care that you made Crusher look ordinary. Torres sat across from Marcus, his expression serious. You need to understand what you've done. In here, reputation is everything. You just damaged his. That wasn't my intention. Intentions don't matter, results do. Torres leaned forward. Now you've got choices. You can capitalize on this. Take his position, build your own reputation. Or you can try to minimize the damage somehow. Marcus was silent for several moments, considering these options with his characteristic thoughtfulness. Neither of those paths interests me. I don't want power over others. I simply want to serve my time peacefully. That's not one of the available choices anymore. The next morning brought palpable tension to breakfast. Inmates divided into watching camps, anticipating Crusher's response. Would he retaliate immediately? Gather forces for overwhelming counterattack? Retreat from leadership through demonstrated weakness? Crusher appeared with his usual associates, but his body language had shifted subtly. Less swagger, more calculation. His eyes found Marcus immediately, holding contact across the crowded space. Neither man looked away, the moment stretching as others watched. Then Crusher did something unexpected. He nodded, a single slight acknowledgement of Marcus's presence, not submission but recognition. Marcus returned the gesture with equal restraint. The room exhaled collective uncertainty. This wasn't open conflict, but it wasn't resolution either. Somewhere between war and peace, both men had found temporary equilibrium. Later that day, during recreation time, Crusher approached Marcus's section of the yard. He came alone, without the usual theatrical backup. Other inmates watched with intense curiosity, trying to predict this next development. We need to talk, Crusher said, his tone lacking the previous aggressive edge. All right, Marcus agreed, gesturing to the space beside him. Crusher sat, an action that surprised both of them slightly. For several moments they existed in shared silence, both men processing the changed dynamics between them. Where'd you learn that? Crusher finally asked, referring to the previous night's confrontation. Aikido. 22 years of study under a Japanese master in Colorado. Understanding emerges. True strength often arrives wearing unexpected faces. When power structures dissolve, new possibilities emerge from the space they occupied. What happens when former adversaries discover common ground? This chapter reveals transformations that reshape everything. Stay engaged, because what develops here changes multiple lives in profound ways. Crusher studied Marcus with genuine curiosity, absent the calculating threat that had characterized their previous interactions. Why didn't you fight back? I mean really fight. Hurt me when you had the chance. Marcus considered how to explain principles that had taken him years to understand. Aikido's founder created it as an art of peace, not war. The goal isn't to defeat opponents, but to resolve conflict without creating unnecessary harm. When you attacked, I received your energy and redirected it. Fighting would have required me to add my own aggression, creating escalation. That sounds like weakness dressed up in fancy philosophy. Maybe. Or maybe it's strength that doesn't need to prove itself through domination. Marcus met Crusher's skeptical gaze directly. You've built power through intimidation and violence. That takes its own kind of strength, the willingness to absorb costs that come with that approach. But it also traps you in constant defense of that position. Crusher's jaw tightened at this assessment, but he didn't reject it immediately. You know nothing about why I do what I do. You're right, I don't. But I'm willing to listen if you want to share. The offer hung between them, unprecedented in their brief relationship. Crusher had spent 15 years building walls against vulnerability, yet something about Marcus's genuine openness created temporary permission to lower defenses. Marcus shook his head. I don't want violence, but I accept that sometimes other people's choices create situations requiring response. My responsibility is to respond appropriately, not to prevent others from making their choices. That evening, the common room filled with inmates seeking weekend entertainment. The film selection, an action movie featuring excessive violence, seemed grimly appropriate. Marcus positioned himself in his usual location, not hiding, but not provocatively visible either. Just present, calm, attentive. Crusher waited until 20 minutes into the film, when attention focused on the screen and guards positioned themselves at maximum distance. He approached Marcus's section with Vince and 2 others, their movement deliberate and purposeful. Outside, now, Crusher said quietly, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Marcus turned from the screen, meeting Crusher's gaze with the same neutral calm he'd maintained since arrival. If you want to talk, we can talk here. I'm done talking. Crusher's hand shot out, gripping Marcus's shirt and pulling him upward. Move! The room's dynamics shifted instantly. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned toward the unfolding confrontation. Some inmates moved closer, drawn by the promise of resolution. Others retreated, avoiding potential involvement. Marcus allowed himself to be pulled to his feet without resisting. His body relaxed despite the aggressive contact. This non-resistance confused Crusher, who'd expected either submission or defensive tension. Getting neither, he intensified his grip, beginning to physically propel Marcus toward the door. I'll walk, Marcus said quietly. You don't need to force me. Something in his tone, neither afraid nor angry, just matter-of-fact, penetrated Crusher's aggressive momentum. He released his grip slightly, and Marcus moved toward the exit with unhurried compliance. Crusher and his associates followed, maintaining intimidating proximity. They emerged into the corridor leading to an unused storage area, away from camera coverage and guard stations. The space had witnessed numerous educational moments in facility history, a fact well known to both men. The confrontation violence reveals essential truths about character that peaceful times can mask. When conflict becomes physical, instinct overwhelms intention. But what happens when someone faces aggression with neither fear nor hatred? This moment will demonstrate principles that most people spend lifetimes never understanding. Stay present, because what unfolds next transcends ordinary conflict resolution. The storage area smelled of industrial cleaning supplies and institutional neglect. Overhead lights buzzed with fluorescent persistence, casting harsh shadows across stacked boxes and abandoned equipment. Crusher positioned himself between Marcus and the exit, his associates flanking for additional intimidation. Here's how this works, Crusher began, his voice carrying the confidence of countless similar moments. You're going to learn respect. Then you're going to tell everyone what you learned. Marcus stood in the center of the space, his posture neither defensive nor aggressive. His hands remained at his sides, his breathing steady and controlled. What would you like me to understand? He asked, genuine curiosity in his tone. The question derailed Crusher's building momentum. He'd expected pleading or defiant bravado, responses that justified the coming violence. This sincere inquiry suggested either profound stupidity or disturbing confidence. Stop talking like we're in a classroom, Vince interjected, stepping forward with raised fists. You're about to get educated the hard way. Vince swung, a heavy right cross aimed at Marcus's face. In that instant, decades of training activated automatically. Marcus's body shifted minimally, turning from the waist, allowing the punch to pass inches from his jaw. His hand rose naturally, not to block, but to guide, making light contact with Vince's extended wrist and redirecting the momentum slightly outward. Vince stumbled forward, carried by his own force and Marcus's subtle redirection. He caught himself against a stack of boxes, spinning back with confusion and renewed anger. Stand still, he shouted, launching another attack. This combination came faster. Left jab, right cross, left hook. Marcus moved like water, each punch meeting only air as he shifted, turned, stepped with minimal economy. His hands rose and fell, making brief contact that added fractional redirection to Vince's committed momentum, using the energy of each attack to increase its overextension. Crusher watched with growing unease. This wasn't fighting. It was something else. Marcus hadn't thrown a single strike, hadn't assumed any recognizable defensive stance, yet Vince couldn't land anything significant. Each attack seemed to defeat itself through Marcus's minimal intervention. "Enough!" Crusher commanded, pushing Vince aside. "I'll handle this." Crusher approached with more calculation than Vince had shown. He was the experienced fighter, someone who'd won dozens of violent encounters through combination of technique and willingness to absorb damage in pursuit of victory. He feinted left, watching Marcus's response, then committed to a powerful right aimed at the body. Marcus accepted the approach, stepping inside the arc of the punch rather than away from it. His left hand rose to meet Crusher's incoming wrist, making contact but not blocking, guiding rather than opposing. Simultaneously, his right hand touched Crusher's elbow, and his body turned sharply. Physics and leverage combined. Crusher felt his own momentum redirected, his balance compromised by forces he couldn't quite identify. He stumbled past Marcus, their positions reversing so quickly he struggled to process what had happened. He spun back, breathing harder now, reassessing his opponent. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "I'm not fighting you," Marcus replied, his breathing still controlled. "I'm simply not letting you hit me." The distinction seemed meaningless to Crusher. He attacked again, this time with a grappling approach rather than striking. If he couldn't hit Marcus, he'd control him through superior size and weight. Marcus accepted the closing distance, his posture remaining upright and balanced. As Crusher's hands reached to grab, Marcus stepped at an angle, his own hands rising to meet Crusher's wrists. The contact was light, almost gentle, but guided Crusher's momentum slightly off target. Before Crusher could adjust, Marcus had shifted his weight, turned his hips, and used Crusher's own forward motion to throw him. The technique was pure Aikido, Kotagaishi, a wrist-turn throw that uses minimal force by blending with the attacker's energy. Crusher found himself airborne briefly, then impacting the concrete floor with stunning force. The breath exploded from his lungs. Marcus stepped back immediately, giving space rather than pressing advantage. "I don't want to hurt you," he said quietly. "We can stop this now." Crusher lay on the floor, stunned physically and psychologically. He'd been thrown by someone who didn't seem to be fighting. The two other associates moved forward uncertainly, looking to Vince for guidance. "Everyone stop," a new voice commanded from the doorway. Unexpected alliance power structures shift when assumptions prove false. What happens when strength reveals itself not through domination, but through restraint? The aftermath of conflict often teaches more than the confrontation itself. Keep reading, because the real transformation is just beginning. Officer Martinez stood in the doorway, his radio already in hand. He was a veteran guard, someone who understood institutional dynamics beyond what official policy acknowledged. He'd witnessed the confrontation's conclusion through careful positioning, close enough to intervene if necessary, distant enough to allow resolution without forcing official documentation. "Everyone back to the common room," Martinez ordered. "Now." The inmates complied, Vince and the other associates helping Crusher to his feet. The big man's expression was complex, humiliation mixed with confusion and something harder to identify. Marcus moved toward the exit with the same unhurried calm he'd maintained throughout, offering no victory gestures or meaningful glances. Martinez let the others pass before falling into step beside Marcus. "That was an interesting demonstration," he said quietly, his tone neutral. "I defended myself without creating additional harm," Marcus replied simply. "That's one interpretation." Martinez paused at the corridor junction. "But you should understand, you just changed the dynamics in C-Block significantly. Crusher won't forget this. I didn't intend to humiliate him, only to prevent violence. Intention and result aren't always aligned." Martinez studied Marcus with professional assessment. "You've got training. Real training, not prison yard brawling." Marcus nodded slightly. 22 years of Aikido, but I haven't used it for violence in decades. You used it tonight. I used it to prevent violence. There's a distinction." Martinez considered this philosophical point before responding. In here, that distinction might not matter to others. You just demonstrated that Crusher couldn't dominate you. That information will spread, and it'll create situations you might not anticipate. I came in scared, Crusher admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. 23 years old, first offense, looking at 25 years minimum. I watched 3 men get hospitalized my first month. Learned real quick that you're either predator or prey, nothing in between. So you chose predator. I chose survival. Built a reputation one fight at a time. After a while, the reputation did most of the work. People fell in line before I had to actually hurt them. He paused, examining his scarred knuckles. But it never stops. Every new guy is a potential challenge. Every sign of weakness invites testing. It's exhausting. Marcus nodded, recognizing the trap Crusher described. And last night I disrupted your system without giving you a clear path to restore it through the usual methods. Yeah, you made me look weak without me being able to prove otherwise, because fighting you again just risks another loss. Crusher's honesty carried weight of accumulated pressure. But here's the thing. I'm also tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of watching my back constantly. Tired of being the person everyone fears. What would you prefer to be? The question landed with unexpected impact. Crusher had spent so long being what survival demanded that he'd forgotten to consider alternatives. I don't know. Someone different. Someone who doesn't need violence to feel safe. That's possible, Marcus said simply. But it requires different kinds of strength than you've been cultivating. Strength like yours. Not like mine specifically. Your own version. Strength that serves your genuine needs rather than your fears. They sat in silence as recreation time wound down, both men processing possibilities that hadn't existed days earlier. Other inmates watched this extended conversation with fascination, recognizing that something significant was shifting in C-Block's power structure. Over the following week, subtle changes rippled through the facility. Crusher still commanded respect, but his approach softened at the edges. He settled disputes through conversation more frequently, resorted to intimidation less reflexively. His associates noticed these changes with mixed reactions, some relieved, others uncertain about implications for their own positions. Marcus became an unofficial advisor of sorts, sought out for perspective on conflicts that previously would have been resolved through violence. His willingness to listen without judgment created space for people to articulate problems they'd never voiced before. Torres watched these developments with amazement. You've transformed this place, he told Marcus one evening. C-Block used to feel like a powder keg. Now it's almost peaceful. I haven't transformed anything, Marcus corrected gently. People are discovering they have choices they didn't know existed. That's all. That's everything. Officer Martinez observed these changes with professional approval. During a routine cell inspection, he paused to speak with Marcus privately. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Incident reports from C-Block are down 40% this month. That's unprecedented. People want peace more than they want power, Marcus replied. They just need permission to believe it's possible. Crusher's changed most dramatically. He's actually helping maintain order now instead of disrupting it. He was always capable of that. He just needed different models of strength to emulate. Martinez shook his head slightly. Don't sell yourself short, Professor. You're providing something this environment rarely offers. Genuine wisdom instead of survival tactics. Ripples of change transformation rarely occurs in isolation. When one person evolves, surrounding systems must adapt or resist. What happens when institutional culture begins shifting toward unexpected directions? This chapter explores how individual change creates collective possibility. Keep reading, because the full scope of impact is just becoming visible. The changes in C-Block attracted attention from facility administration. Warden Patricia Holbrook reviewed the behavioral reports with cautious optimism. Violence incidents down 43%. Disciplinary actions reduced by 31%. Sick calls, often indicators of depression and despair, decreased by 24%. She requested a meeting with Marcus, curious about the man at the center of these statistical improvements. He arrived at her office escorted by Martinez, his demeanor calm and respectful without the servile quality many inmates adopted when facing authority. Mr. Webb, thank you for meeting with me, Holbrook began, gesturing to a chair. I've been reviewing reports from C-Block. The changes there are remarkable. The men deserve credit for those changes, Marcus replied. I've simply offered different perspectives when asked. Officer Martinez tells me you have extensive martial arts training, that you demonstrated significant skill when confronted. Marcus nodded. 22 years of Aikido study, but the physical techniques are less relevant than the philosophical principles they teach. Harmony instead of conflict, redirection instead of opposition. Holbrook leaned forward with interest. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to formalize that teaching. We have a recreation program budget that could support a class. Teach interested inmates some of what you know. The proposal surprised Marcus. He'd anticipated various outcomes from his time at Riverbend, but becoming an official instructor hadn't been among them. I'd need to consider how to adapt the curriculum appropriately, he said thoughtfully. Aikido includes potentially dangerous techniques that would be inappropriate in this environment. Focus on the philosophical components you mentioned: self-discipline, conflict resolution, emotional regulation. Holbrook pulled a file from her desk. Your background as a professor makes you uniquely qualified. We've never had an inmate with your credentials willing to contribute to programming. I'll do it, Marcus decided. But I have conditions. The class must be voluntary. No mandatory attendance that creates resentment. And I'll need Crusher, Danny Morrison, as my assistant. Holbrook's eyebrows rose. Morrison, the same man who's been our most frequent disciplinary concern for a decade? The same. He's been making remarkable progress toward personal transformation. Giving him formal responsibility would reinforce that trajectory while providing him legitimate leadership role. That's an unusual request. Most valuable changes begin as unusual requests. Holbrook studied Marcus for several moments before nodding. Approved. You'll have 2 hours twice weekly in the gymnasium. Maximum enrollment 15 inmates initially. We'll assess after 3 months. News of the approved class spread quickly through C-Block. Reactions varied from curiosity to skepticism. Some inmates saw opportunity for genuine growth. Others suspected ulterior motives, perhaps the administration seeking to domesticate potentially violent men into compliance. Crusher's appointment as assistant instructor created particular interest. His public alignment with Marcus's approach signaled definitive shift in C-Block's power structure. Those who'd benefited from the previous system felt uncertain. Those who'd suffered under it felt cautiously hopeful. The first class convened on a Tuesday evening. 14 men attended, an eclectic mix of ages, backgrounds, and criminal histories. Marcus began not with physical techniques but with questions. Why are you here? He asked simply. Silence initially, broken gradually by tentative responses. Some admitted curiosity about the fighting skills Marcus had demonstrated. Others expressed desire for anger management tools. Several acknowledged simply wanting something constructive to occupy time. Marcus listened to each response without judgment, nodding acknowledgement. When everyone had spoken, he shared his own answer. I'm here because I took a life through careless action. That reality shapes everything I do now. I can't restore what I destroyed, but I can perhaps prevent others from causing similar harm, to others or themselves. He paused, meeting their collective gaze. This class isn't about learning to fight. It's about learning not to need fighting. It's about discovering strength that doesn't require proving itself through domination. Crusher stepped forward then, his presence commanding attention through established habit. Most of you know who I was, who I've been for 15 years here. I built power through violence and fear. His voice carried unusual vulnerability. Professor Webb showed me that strength can look different. That real power might mean controlling yourself instead of controlling others. I'm here to learn that with you. The honesty in Crusher's admission created permission for others to acknowledge their own needs. The class's energy shifted from skeptical assessment to genuine engagement. Over subsequent weeks, attendance grew. Word spread about the class's unique approach. Less about physical techniques, more about mental discipline and emotional awareness. Marcus taught basic breathing exercises, meditation practices, conflict de-escalation communication. Crusher demonstrated how these principles applied to actual prison situations, sharing his own struggles to change ingrained patterns. Legacy beyond walls. Some transformations echo beyond their immediate circumstances, creating ripples that touch lives far removed from original actions. What happens when individual growth becomes collective evolution? This final chapter reveals how one person's principles can reshape entire communities. Stay present until the end, because this conclusion offers insights that transcend any single story. 6 months into the program, Marcus sat in Warden Holbrook's office reviewing assessment data. Behavioral improvements had not only sustained but expanded. The class had grown to 3 sections serving 42 inmates across different security levels. Recidivism rates among program participants showed preliminary decline, though follow-up periods remained too short for statistical confidence. "You've created something remarkable," Holbrook said, genuine admiration in her voice. "Other facilities are requesting information about replicating your program." Marcus shifted slightly, uncomfortable with individual credit for collective achievement. "The men themselves deserve recognition. I simply provided framework. They did the difficult work of actual transformation." Humble as always, Holbrook smiled. "But leadership matters, and you've demonstrated exceptional leadership. Which brings me to a proposal." She slid documents across her desk. Marcus scanned them quickly. Application materials for parole consideration, supported by unprecedented administrative endorsements. His scheduled release date was still 18 months distant, but early release remained theoretically possible for model prisoners who demonstrated exceptional rehabilitation. "I'm recommending you for immediate parole consideration," Holbrook continued. "Your contributions here have been extraordinary. You've served your time with dignity and created lasting positive impact." Marcus was silent for several moments, processing this unexpected possibility. Freedom beckoned with undeniable appeal. Return to meaningful life outside institutional walls. Yet he also recognized unfinished work here, connections forged through shared growth that would dissolve upon his departure. "What happens to the program if I leave?" he asked. "Crusher, Morrison, has demonstrated capacity to lead it. We'd provide additional training and supervision initially. The program would continue." Marcus considered this carefully. Crusher had indeed grown tremendously, evolving from institutional predator to genuine leader serving others' growth. Perhaps the most powerful teaching Marcus could offer was demonstrating trust in that transformation by allowing Crusher to assume full responsibility. "I'll accept the recommendation," Marcus decided, "but with a request that I'm allowed to return monthly as volunteer once released, to support program continuity and mentor Morrison's leadership development." "That's highly unusual. Insurance and liability concerns. Create precedent. These men need to see that transformation doesn't end at prison gates, that someone who learned discipline here can apply it successfully in free society." Holbrook regarded him thoughtfully before nodding. "I'll present your condition to the board. No promises, but I'll advocate strongly." The parole hearing occurred 3 weeks later. Marcus appeared before the board with unusual support. Warden Holbrook's endorsement, Officer Martinez's detailed testimony about behavioral changes in C Block, written statements from 42 program participants describing impact on their lives. The victim's family attended, as was their right. The young woman's mother sat in the front row, her face carrying years of grief that no justice system could truly address. When given opportunity to speak, she stood slowly. "I've hated you," she said directly to Marcus, her voice shaking. "For 5 years, I've carried that hatred like burning coal." She paused, struggling with emotion. "But I've been following reports about your work in prison, about how you're helping other men avoid the mistakes you made. And I realize that hatred hurts me more than it affects you." Tears streamed down her face now, years of pain finding release. "I can't forgive you for taking my daughter, but I can acknowledge that you're doing something meaningful with the life you still have. That matters, even though she's still gone." Marcus stood, meeting her gaze directly. "I carry responsibility for her death every day. Nothing I do will change that reality or diminish your loss. But I'm grateful that my work brings some small meaning to senseless tragedy. Thank you for finding space to acknowledge that despite your justified pain." The board deliberated for 2 hours before announcing their decision. Parole granted, contingent on continued community service related to violence prevention and conflict resolution. Monthly volunteer access to Riverbend approved as pilot program, subject to ongoing evaluation. Marcus's final weeks in C-Block carried bittersweet quality. Men who'd transformed through the program approached him individually, sharing gratitude and requesting final guidance. Crusher especially seemed affected by the impending departure, uncertain about assuming full program leadership. "You've got everything necessary," Marcus assured him during their last private conversation. "The techniques I taught are less important than the principles behind them. Help people discover their own strength rather than imposing your vision of what they should become." "What if I fail? What if the program collapses without you?" "Then it wasn't built on solid foundation." "But I don't believe that. You've changed too fundamentally to revert to previous patterns. Trust your growth." Crusher nodded slowly, accepting both the responsibility and the confidence Marcus offered. "I'm going to miss having you here, Professor. You saw something in me nobody else did." "I saw what was always there, waiting for conditions that made it safe to emerge. You did the actual work of allowing that emergence." On release day, Marcus walked through Riverbend's gates carrying the same small box of belongings he'd arrived with 5 years earlier. But he also carried something less tangible, evidence that even in darkest environments, transformation remains possible. That strength manifests through discipline rather than domination. That one person's principled presence can create permission for collective evolution. He turned back once, looking at the facility's imposing walls. Inside, 42 men continued practicing the principles he'd shared. Breathing through anger, communicating without aggression, finding center when chaos threatened. Crusher led that evening's class, his voice carrying authority earned through genuine transformation rather than imposed fear. Marcus smiled slightly before continuing toward his waiting ride. The work continued, both behind those walls and in the free world he rejoined. The principles he'd cultivated through 2 decades of Aikido study and 5 years of profound testing had proven their worth beyond any dojo or classroom setting. True strength, he'd discovered, never required domination. It simply required unwavering commitment to principles that honored human dignity, his own and everyone he encountered. The prison bully who'd once ruled through fear now taught peace to those who'd never imagined it possible. And the quiet professor who'd arrived expecting only to serve penance had discovered purpose that transformed punishment into unexpected grace. If this story of transformation resonated with you, share it with someone who needs reminding that change remains possible regardless of circumstances. Subscribe for more narratives exploring the unexpected paths toward wisdom, dignity, and human connection. Your journey toward inner strength begins with recognizing it's always been available. You simply needed permission to access it.